to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk to you guys about putting together your backmount rig. It's pretty much a standard rig that you would put together while using doubles. I've been through a couple of configurations, and what I'm about to share with you is just really my own opinion about what works for me. I'll tell you some pros and cons to certain things that I liked about some equipment versus others, and I'll explain why I'm currently using the setup that I am now. All right, the first thing I'm going to talk about are your cylinders. I've been through a couple of configurations for cylinders. When I first got into this, I started off with some Luxford aluminum 80s, just regular low pressure aluminum 80s. And they worked fine, actually. Some advantages to the aluminum Luxford 80s were that they were a little bit lighter, and when you get into the water, they're a lot more buoyant than, say, these steel 100s. I then changed up my gear and I went to some high pressure Luxford aluminum 80s. Now there they were just a little more heavier than the regular Luxford aluminum 80s, but the really neat thing about those cylinders is when they're empty, they are still 1 pound negative compared to the Luxford low pressure aluminum 80s, which at around 500 psi, they're about 3-4 pounds positive. And so this is the reason why I decided to switch completely from aluminum tanks to the steels. The bottom line for me was that I didn't like having to add additional weight when diving aluminum tanks. Now, when I had my aluminum tanks, depending on which ones I was using, the low pressure aluminum 80s needed way more weight than the high pressure aluminum 80s. The low pressure aluminum 80s, I was adding between 10 to 15 pounds on top of the weight of those tanks. And so, like I said, each tank is about 31 pounds times 2. Now you're talking 62 pounds. And now you're adding an additional 15 pounds on top of that, just so that you can maintain your buoyancy in the water. The high pressure aluminums, I also had to add weight, but it was more like 8 pounds versus the 15 pounds that I was using. Now when I'm using the steel 100s, I dive with no additional weight whatsoever. And for me, having to lug these things around on the land, that was sort of a game changer for me, because together each tank's about 34 pounds, so now you're talking 68 pounds on your back. And I do a lot of shore diving, so walking from my truck to the water, not having to add that extra weight really made a difference for me. All right, once you've figured out what cylinders you're going to use, the next thing you're going to have to try to figure out is what manifold are you going to use and what bands. I went with 7 in, I believe these are 7¼ inch bands, so that they fit aluminum 80s, steel 100s. They do make these bigger. You can buy them in the 8-inch configuration. If you're going to use a tank like a 117 or 133, those are ginormous tanks, a lot fatter because they're holding way more air. But we'll talk more about that later on. All right, the next thing you're going to have to try to figure out is what kind of backplate you're going to use. Now, I can tell you this is the backplate that I use when I'm using my doubles. It's a single loop strap harness that I use, and as you can see, there's no weight pouches attached to it. I personally like to have dual D-rings, more connection points. The purists will say you only need 1. Again, those are opinions. So I personally like having 2, whereas others would prefer 1. So this is my backplate that I use for my doubles, and the purists are going to say this is what you need: a single nylon strap that's continuous all the way through so that it reduces any breaking points. All right, so this is the backplate that I use for my recreational rig. Now, this originally was the backplate that I was using when I first started getting into technical diving. And I'll be honest with you, I personally really like this because it was adjustable on the fly. The single loop is adjustable, but it takes more steps to actually adjust. Whereas this harness here, you can actually adjust while you put it on. And I'll show you what I mean. So after you attach your waist strap, this also has a chest strap, but it's removable. You can take it right off. Just that on the fly. And here, the shoulder straps you can adjust, just like you would on a regular recreational harness. Again, completely adjustable on the fly. Now, the purists are gonna say, hey, there's failure points here, you have all these other things that are in the way. Again, it's all about what your personal preferences are, and this was perfect for me when I first got into technical diving. It was just a lot more comfortable, it wasn't awkward, and I really liked it. All right, next thing I'm going to talk to you about is bladders. Now, here's where I was just completely confused getting into technical diving. I had no clue. It seemed like every person I asked, they had a different opinion about what size you needed and what brand you needed to get. And I'll be honest with you, it doesn't matter what brand you get, it's whatever you like, use. They are all, for the most part, designed about the same. Every manufacturer is going to have their touch on a bladder or a backplate, but quite frankly, they're all about the same. They're all designed the same and very much interchangeable. If you like a Hollis bladder, you could put it on a Scuba Pro backplate. They're for the most part, you can attach these different components on each other and have a multi-manufacturer tech rig if that's what you want to do. But here is where I got really confused, and hopefully I can clear things up. Again, my opinion about size is exactly that, my opinion. So I currently use a 45-pound bladder with my Steel 100s. Now, when I first got into this, I was like, oh, I'm using Steel 100s, I'm gonna need 65 pounds lift. That's completely not true. The 45-pound lift bladder actually works perfectly fine with my Steel 100s. Like I said, in water, you're not as heavy compared to dry land. And with 45 pounds, that provides plenty of lift for what I need while technical diving. Now, they do make a 60-pound bladder, and the way that was explained to me was the size of your tanks. A regular steel tank that's 7¼ inches really only needs about 45 pounds lift. It's about the right size from tank to tank to fit around it and kind of cradle it while you're diving. The larger tanks, the tanks that are about 8 inches in diameter, those tanks will need the 60-pound bladder because it's a little wider and able to cradle those tanks a lot better during your lift. And that's how it's been explained to me, what the difference between the two are. So when you're out there trying to figure out what I need, I like the Steel 100, I think I'm gonna need 60-pound lift. That's completely false. Now the purists are gonna say, well, you need 60 pounds lift because if you come across an unconscious diver underwater or a non-responsive diver, you're gonna need the lift to carry them with all of their weight, with their doubles and your weight. Completely not true. Again, boils down to personal preference. Whatever you like and whatever works for you, go with. But for myself, the 45-pound bladder works perfect. All right, you got your bladder and your backplate figured out. I'm now going to install it onto my doubles. When you're tightening down your butterfly nuts, you just have to tighten them down hand tight. You don't have to bust out a wrench to tighten them down. Hand tight will work just fine. All right, when choosing your regulator set, I know for me, I had a lot of questions going in and I really didn't know what worked. And again, there, I had a number of different configurations. So currently I have the DCX first stage, and I also did order a set of 200 LXs, but they're back in the shop because I accidentally tweaked it a little too hard. Currently, my current setup right now, as far as my regulators that I'm using, is the Scuba Pro R195, which, in my opinion, I really like this regulator. It's basic, it draws really well, and overall, I think it's a good regulator. One thing that I like a lot about the DCX, and every manufacturer makes this, the bottom half it swivels, it rotates, it moves around. Scuba Pro also makes a similar design. I think it's called the MX or the MK25. My first setup, I used the MK11s, which I really liked a lot. The difference is it doesn't have the swivel point, but it does have 3 low pressures on one side and the other. Here's the first stage I was using when I first put my rig together. It's the Scuba Pro MK11. I really liked this setup a lot, mainly because each side you have your ports on this first stage. And the way I set it up was, whether it's gonna be my right post or my left post, I connected everything that I needed to connect on each side. So on my right post, I would have my transponder connected here, and then I'd have my long hose connected here, and then I would have my low pressure inflator hose connected to this port, and then everything kind of hung down below. This would route that way, this would route that way, and this would kind of point out a little bit. Now, Hollis also makes a very similar first stage design just like this, and the high pressure port is actually behind, so some people like that. It's really all personal preference. I really like this setup a lot because I can set everything up nice and flat like this with my hoses all pointing down. Nice clean look at the top. So my right post setup, I have my low pressure inflator hose attached to the bottom, and this runs to my BCD and attaches to the low pressure inflator hose connector there. I am running my transponder on one side. Now again, the purists are gonna say don't use a transponder. It's electronic, it could fail. Yeah, well, on one side, my personal preference is I like having a transponder on my right post. And I also have my long hose attached to my right post as well. All right, this is my left post, and at the very bottom of my first stage, I have my necklace that I have attached to it. And the high pressure port, I have my analog gauge attached. And at the bottom, the part that actually swivels, I have a low pressure hose for my dry suit connector. All right, I'm going to install my regulators to the tanks, and I always start with my right post first, mainly because the long hose, it's kind of unwieldy, and I want to get it on there so I can connect my BCD first, and then I can wrap around my 7-foot hose to one of the straps. So I'm going to do the right post first, and then the left post second. you guys found this to be very, very helpful. Also, I hope that answered some of the questions that you may have had when you're starting to think about putting your tech rig together. The bottom line really is, whatever is good for you, go with it. Try not to let other people influence you. Do ask the questions, ask the right people, but whatever you choose is really going to be the rig that you're going to be comfortable with. Now, there's going to be different opinions and comments and whatnot, and feel free to just add your comments and thoughts down below. I'll respond to all your comments and opinions about various rigs that you yourself may have put together. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to subscribe. I intend on putting out many other videos about gear and diving here in San Diego. Thank you and enjoy.